Hi, everyone. What we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce Unit 3, which is Power, Protest, and Change. So we've just finished up Great Gatsby, and now we're moving on to another unit back in our regular textbook. And this one just so happens to be very relevant to things that are going on in the world today and things that have already happened. And so, like I said, all that has to do with power, protest, and change. And we're mostly going to be talking about the time period between 1850 and 1914. So let's get after it then. So the essential question for this unit is as follows, and you can see it on the screen. So, in what ways does the struggle for freedom change with history? So, in what ways does the struggle for freedom change with history? So, in other words, over the decades, how have different struggles for rights changed, or have they? So, we've studied, and you've definitely studied, things over the course of your education and, that discuss like struggles for freedom uh, for individuals. Now, a lot of those things haven't changed over the years. Where some people are still struggling and striving for the same freedoms that they have for hundreds of years. So you could look at it in that sense and say that things really haven't changed, but you could say that things have changed depending on which groups you're talking about. Now, one of the quotes that is listed in your book, and I really thought it was pretty poignant as to what we're going to be talking about, and definitely relevant to things that are going on still now, is this quote here above me here by Frederick Douglass. So he says, or said, those who profess a favor to freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be physical, or it may be both. Power concedes nothing without a demand. So, what does this mean? So, basically, what he's getting at is those who favor freedom but don't want to work for it are like people who plant crops without doing any work. So, you can't get something from nothing. Okay. So he says, power concedes nothing without demand. So people have to stand up for what they believe in and work for it. So, as I mentioned, so they profess a favor, and yet they're like, so some want freedom and want things to happen, but don't want to do the work for it. Or some people say they want change and do nothing. And so this has been the same struggle for hundreds of years. So Frederick Douglass is an American hero, and he was a slave, gained his freedom, became a big time abolitionist, and so his words are still relevant to us now. Okay, so he's saying that there's a struggle. It could be moral, it could be physical, it might be both, but you have to demand what you want and work for it. Okay, so this whole unit deals with that. And so we're kind of going to go back in time to things we talked about at the beginning of the year and then also move forward. So, like I said, most of the things we're going to be focusing on are 19th and early 20th century issues. Okay. But in order to understand that struggle, we kind of have to go back to things we talked about at the beginning of the year. So, as it says in your book, the U.S. was founded on dreams people had of shaping the society in which they live. So there's a certain way that people wanted to live and operate based on their past. So the Puritans came from England to build a new society based off of religious freedom. Then, 150 years after they showed up, the founders, who you see in the picture, wrote the Constitution that gave citizens powerful tools to continue shaping society. a reshaping society. So after that 150 years, we still had a lot of problems. So we weren't yet free. We didn't have freedom of speech. We didn't have a government that best represented people's individual interests. And so we had a revolution. Okay. Then, with all of that, so with these changes, it was believed that citizens could change the course of the country for the years to come. And they did, but still not for everyone. So, one of the things that is still going on at the time is slavery. So, yes, and we've discussed this. Yes, people wanted freedom. Yes, people wanted their own government that best represented the people. However, a lot of the people in the United States at the time, so as you see here, the stat on the top, 88% of blacks in the United States in the 1850s were slaves. That meant 12% of those people were free, a very small number. So clearly, there's a conflict here. Not everybody's interests are being preserved. So by 1850, those tools of freedom of speech and self-government and all that stuff, those come into question, particularly with regard to slavery. So many people are going to say, well, 88% of a portion of the population is not free. And so many in the nation cry out for change. However, the main gripe with people in the South, particularly those who relied on the practice of slavery, do not want anything changed because their whole livelihood relies on it. So the economy of the South depended on slavery, and therefore many rally to keep the institution in place. So think of it in terms of this. Think about it like today, okay? If all of a sudden we wanted to move away from people doing most of the jobs and having it all automated and mechanical, some of this stuff is happening. A lot of people are going to be upset because their way of life is going to be changed. Now, that's a very simple example, but it's kind of relevant to the overall example. So think back to what I just said about the practice of slavery. Their whole livelihood depended on it. And so they want it in place because they don't want their livelihood and to change, and they don't want their economy to fail. Now, in the North, that's not an issue because industry had replaced agriculture years before. So critics of the practice are more vocal in their opposition, with abolitionists campaigning against slavery and assisting runaway slaves. All right. So the abolitionists and those against slavery are very critical of the practice. They're very vocal people. They're much more vocal than those who want to keep the practice in place. And most of those people are going to be located in the North. So they know a life in the North without slavery. They know it can work. So industry has replaced agriculture. Industry has given people jobs. Okay. Now, moving on. So, partially because of the practice of slavery and the want of many to get rid of the practice of slavery, we had a civil war. Now, you'll hear like, well, slavery was an issue that caused a civil war. True, but not totally. So there's several events and occurrences that contribute to the start of the Civil War, not just one particular event. One of those events is the election of Abraham Lincoln. So he is elected president in 1860, and because of his election and his stance on slavery, it only increased the division between North and South. So his victory in terms of slavery puts the nation on the course to both conflict and healing. Now, that seems like two contrasting ideas, and it really is. So his stance on slavery caused a lot of conflict, but it also eventually is going to lead to people coming together. So one of the other reasons, and I mentioned there's many, and I kind of touched on this in the last slide, that that the Civil War takes place is economics. So both sides want to maintain their way of life. They don't like change. They don't want change, especially in the South. So that's another factor that's going to come into play here. So the war itself and the decisions of Lincoln are going to confirm the strength of the central government over the states. So Lincoln, and I'm not going to get into a lot of particulars here. Lincoln takes many steps in order to place the emphasis on a strong central government that's going to keep things in order. One of those is the suspension of habeas corpus. Now, the South believes the opposite. They believe that as states, they have the right to decide what they want to do. This is still a conflict that we have now. Okay. So, with a lot of current events and a lot of new laws and things like that, the states have decided what they want or what they believe to be right, whereas the federal government might have a different stance. That's the way that our democratic republic works. Okay, is that yes, Uncle Sam, the federal government has ideas on how things should be run, but we also, as individual states, can make our own laws. The same, it all goes back to this time and prior. Okay, now in the meantime, or at the same time, I should say, there's a lot of things going on in terms of change and movement of people. So, because of the population growth, the need for expansion becomes more evident. So, the only way to really go is west. And so, by doing that, people are going to load up on the wagons like the Oregon Trail, as you see in the picture, and start moving west. Now, that creates some issues, especially for Native Americans, and through some racist practices, they're forced off their land to accommodate settlers. Not fair. That's what happened, and people were moving more westward. So, as I mentioned earlier, progress is being made in the nation's cities. So, electricity is used on a wide scale to light up the cities and also power machines. And then both of those ideas are combined through the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. So, by connecting the United States from east to west, we were able to guarantee the movement of people, guarantee trade, the movement of goods and things to really grow the West Coast and expand our American way of life. Now, there's some things like the treatment of Native Americans in this instance were very cruel byproducts of an overall good idea. So the fact that we were able to move westward, great idea. Okay, the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. I would argue that that was the internet of its time. And so by doing that, though, some people were disenfranchised. That's the downside of things. Okay, that should have never been done. But people at the time weren't thinking in terms of that. We can look back on it and say, yes, that was wrong. However, the expansion and progress made has left a lasting footprint. So, in moving on, because of some of that disenfranchisement, people are going to look at themselves and their individual groups and say, hey, we're not being treated very fairly. So there's many reform movements and conventions that took place that were going to ensure that people were getting a fair shake. So they realized the need for change in the late 19th century. There was many groups in the United States that are disenfranchised. So women, children, former slaves. And so there were efforts made, especially in terms of education, the justice system, and prison reform that were going to help people. Now, here's the thing. These are still things that we're fighting now. Okay? These are still issues that are prevalent today. Now, so the way that I look at it, and I mentioned this in the last unit, does history repeat itself? No, but it definitely echoes. So let's just look at prison reform. This is stuff that's happening in our world today. There are cities, so like city of Chicago has emptied out many, not emptied out totally, but has sent people out of jail. They said, go ahead, go home. You're in here for minor crimes. We're not holding you here for something very minor. In a way that's fair, and some people might say that's fair. Some might say that's dangerous, okay? But the fact of the matter is, people have realized that that still needs to be reformed. Public education, same thing. Reforms need to be made, especially in our inner city schools, okay? So, one of I would say the main fight, though, of the early 20th century was with the women's right to vote. This was something that had happened or was going on since the 1840s. Women didn't get the right to vote till 1920. So many of the women, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who are fighting for the women's right to vote and equal rights for women, didn't really get to see their work come to fruition. So women take up this issue of the right to vote and fight for their cause. It's one that like I said, lasted for many decades and to no avail. It never came through. And so because the powers that be viewed women as inferior to men and unable to participate in democracy. So later on, though, in 1920, eventually the law is passed. So women in the United States have been able to vote for 100 years. Okay, that's not a long time. So it's through the efforts of women like this that started in the 1840s that these things came to be. Now, the nation itself came of age during this period. So what does that mean? So one thing you have to realize, none of this is going to be perfect. So was there social progress, industrial progress, and economic development? Yes. Was all of it perfect and everybody taken care of? No. Okay. But things start to happen where people realize that there's wrongs going on. These things take a long time to change for whatever reason. So, like I said, the country is coming of age. It's taking care of people better. Perfect? No. Better? Yes. Okay. Now, one of the things two of the things that I would say are the biggest changes during this time period are the industrial and economic progress that the country made. So, especially in the North, like I mentioned at the beginning, the movement was away from agriculture and into industry. So making things, creating. And the United States was able to assert itself then on the international stage. So by becoming more industrial, we were able to sell our goods to other countries and first off, make a profit. Second off, become a world power and become rich. So the trade between the U.S. and other nations becomes a mainstay. So this is still going on today. We talk about trade all the time, especially in terms of us and China. And the Chinese-U.S. relationships in terms of trade began not in the 90s or 80s or 70s. It's the 1870s, 1880s. That's when these things start to begin. And so it's been an issue for over 100 years, okay? Now, all in all, this creates a legacy of protest. So like I said, despite all of the good that occurs, there's a lot of turbulence and issues and things that weren't totally resolved with regard to equal rights. So like I said, this unit covers 1850 to 1914. Women don't get the right to vote till 1920. The right to vote for minorities is not guaranteed until the 1960s, 1965. So 100 years after some of this stuff is happening. So, however, the spirit of protest of the time is the lasting legacy. So whether it's minority rights, women's rights, right to work, right to organized labor, all of those things, and all of those people who are willing to fight for that, for what they believed was right and decent, that spirit continues now. So it lays the groundwork for a lot of the protests that we see today. I would like to think that with most of the protests that are going on, or that have happened, not going on at the moment, okay, this is 2 days after the election. We don't know what'll happen. Okay, you guys aren't going to view this until you're viewing this on Tuesday. I don't know what happened over the weekend, however, there's still a spirit of protest within a lot of us today. Okay, there's certain things that I stand up for and I'm big on. There's things that you stand up for and advocate, and a lot of that comes out of this time. A lot of it runs in our families. Okay, and so you have to look at these people as really pioneers of protest, that they were able to stand up for what they believed in at that time, and then that has carried with us up until today. So think back to the quote that I mentioned at the beginning, okay, from Frederick Douglass. Here it is. So those who want to do things without putting in the work, those who want to protest without advocating for the work, are really doing nothing. Okay? So power concedes nothing without demand. You have to demand change in order to get it. Okay? So I hope that that's a message that you carry with you throughout this unit as we read certain things. So as you probably already know, there's times during this video in which you're going to have to stop and answer some questions. So I'm holding you accountable for this. Make sure that you're completing that and getting it completed in time and turned in a timely manner. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day.